Okay, let's continue our discussion of Roman women. In terms of marrying, their ages for being eligible to be married are very different from our society. So 12 years old was the legal limit. And what we found is that the age of 14 for the Romans seemed to be the perfect age for marrying. Now, I know this lecture is about women, but I will tell you that men got married much older than this, so they were taking very young wives. You could be engaged to be married quite a bit younger than this, and then once you got to the age of 12, you could be married off. One thing to think about in terms of the differences between this society and ours is that the life expectancy was about 30, meaning 30 was old age. So things tended to be much, much earlier than what's happening now. We've talked about the power of the father in Roman society, and excuse me, we know that the father really controlled the marriage as well. The daughter usually had a say in who she was married, although it really depends on what family you were talking about. And the mother usually had no choice. Now that's, as I put in theory, that's what the texts tell us, but you have to sort of imagine yourself being in that situation. And do you really have no say? Does the mother really have no say or not? So it's hard to really guess on that. In marriages, women were expected to be happy within their marriage. Their main duty, and I'll get to this in just a second, was to have children. Divorce rate was about 20% as far as we can tell from the records. Now, there are a couple of different types of marriages, and within our class period, you see it sort of an evolution happening in terms of marriage. So you have something called cum manu or sine manu. Cum manu means with the hand or with the power. And before the 1st century BC, which is most of the Roman Republic, you've got this type of marriage called cum manu, or with the power, with the hand. And the woman who was getting married moved out of the power of her father and moved into the power of her husband's family, sometimes her husband's father if he was still alive, or with the husband. And as I put here, the husbands controlled everything. So when a woman got married, she had a dowry, which was sort of some wealth that was moved from her family into her new family. If she got divorced, the husband would keep everything in this. And really at this point, the woman had a really hard time getting divorced on her own. Later on, from the 1st century BC onwards, so towards the end of the period of our class, you get something marriages called sine manu, or without the hand. This was where the woman really remained under the power of her own father, even though she's married to somebody else. So what that really means, and I put a few examples here, is that when the dowry is given to her new husband's family, if she happened to get a divorce, that dowry had to be returned. And so it's a very different type of marriage, what we see. And I know in one of the articles that I had you read, it talks about how this actually gives women more rights, because women were probably treated much better in a marriage like this, because if she ends up getting a divorce, all that wealth that came with her, if it did come with her, goes back to her family. When you do sort of a comparison of ancient women, especially when you compare Greek and Roman women, Greek women were fairly isolated. They rarely left their households. But in Rome, you don't really have that. Women weren't really isolated. I give you a list of places here that women could go into all these different places. Now, usually you would be accompanied by a male family member, but there seems to be no hesitation into allowing women out into society. I've already talked a little bit about this when I talked about wealthy girls. So wealthy women would run their households, manage the financial aspects of their household. As I put here, manage tenants. So if they had a large block of land that they were renting, they would also take care of that. Now they could have a will, And of course, it really depends on whether you're talking about the cum manu marriage or the sine manu marriage, but she could have a will, excuse me, and if for some reason her husband dies and her father dies, she could be legally independent in this later part of the Roman Republic, but she would always have a male guardian. Now, there's lots of discussion in the text, and hopefully you've read the article about how technically women have to have a male guardian, but sometimes the male guardian just let them do what they wanted to do, and it indicates that women had a fair bit of freedom in terms of managing their own affairs when they didn't have a husband or a father. Women, as you probably know, had no public duties, so no voting, no running for office. They didn't hold these high positions in society. However, if you read through the literature and read sort of between the lines, you see that women had quite a bit of private influence about what was going on in the public sphere at this point. I've given you quite a bit of text here from Livy. What you need to do is really stop the video and then read through this, where Livy, excuse me, Livy is talking about what is happening in terms of why women don't have power. So why don't you do that, and then we'll continue on. Okay, so there are various ideas on why women couldn't be involved in public affairs. And again, what we're getting all of this written material from are men who are writing about this. So women are thought to be more irrational. Sorry, my cat's in the background. More emotional and less intellectual. And of course, this is probably no big surprise because a lot of women weren't allowed to be educated. So of course, they're less intellectual and so on. So it's the Roman society's structure keeping these women down, and then that keeping down is the reason for why they're not allowed to move up. It's also thought that when women were actually educated, they were a danger to becoming equal with men, and you could see this from the passage from Livy. We do have quite a bit of artwork showing women, and so a lot of the information we have about women, especially in the later period, comes from some of this artwork, especially when you've got the name of somebody, their status, and what they did. One different type of woman in the Republic was something called a Vestal Virgin. And these were women who were priestesses that were dedicated to the Roman goddess Vesta, who was the protector of the household. These Vestal Virgins were actually protectors of the entire state, the Res Publica, and of course of the house. These Vestal Virgins, as you can see from the virgin part, they were not supposed to have sex. They had quite a bit of power because they were seen as the protectors of the state. So they were meant to be seen by a lot of people. Fasces accompanied them. What that means is that they had their protectors, and you would have them carrying various items. Like we talked about, the consuls would have these lictors that would travel with them, that would either have an axe or a bundle of sticks to show their power. Even the consuls made way for them. So if a Vestal Virgin was walking through a public area and the consul was there, he would have to move out of the way. And they had their own dedicated seats in the theater. These Vestal Virgins were chosen from the wealthy families. We know occasionally that their power was even used by the consuls in terms of being ambassadors. And because they were considered to be very pure, they could witness various legal documents that normal women could not, and could also speak openly in courts just because of their positions. Now, how do you become a Vestal Virgin? Well, they're coming from these wealthy families, and they are removed from the power of their father. So this is very different than what we've talked about in terms of the children of fathers being in their control, even sometimes after the women are married off. There is a sort of a legal thing that happens where the young girls are taken away from the father of the power, and that power is cut off. They are then under the control of what's called the Pontifex Maximus, or the great priest. And then I've listed here some of the duties that they had. Now, the last slide here I want to talk about is what happens to these women when they break the vow. Now, as I mentioned, they were considered to be the ones that were protecting the state. If they break their vows, then people saw this as being a danger to the entire state itself. What happened to these women who would say have sex with somebody is they would be put on trial. If they're found guilty, the punishments were pretty severe. So as I put here, they were sometimes buried alive, and then their memories were erased from public record, meaning that their names were taken off the list, and any place that their name was mentioned, they were taken off. And it was really bad for the reputation of the family that she came from because she broke her vows. So I hate to sort of end the lecture on women with this sort of depressing slide about the breaking of the vows. But again, make sure that you go back and read those articles that I've given you to read on Roman women, and then put all of this into the context of Roman society.